Today, I picked up one jar of Nutella off the shelf at Publix, turned it around in my hand, and read every word on the back before I put a single thing in my cart. Sugar is the first word on that ingredient list. Not hazelnuts, not cocoa. Sugar. First, ahead of the palm oil, ahead of everything this jar is actually famous for. I'm going to hand you a number before I explain it, because I want you carrying it through this whole video. 13%. Hold on to that. By the end, you'll know exactly why it matters, and you'll know exactly where my final verdict on this jar landed. Buy it, or leave it right there on the shelf. I'm not telling you yet. Read the label with me first, the way I was taught to read anything before I trusted it. Tell me the truth in the comments before we go any further. Do you spread this on toast in the morning and call it breakfast? Or is it dessert in your house, and you already knew that before I said a word? I want to know which one you are. Nutella did not end up in nearly every pantry in this country by accident. It built that reputation on one very specific idea, that a chocolate hazelnut spread could sit at the breakfast table beside the eggs and the toast, not beside the ice cream and the cookies, where a spread this sweet would normally belong. That's what a marketer would call a health halo. You dress a treat in the language of a wholesome morning, put a spoon and some bread on the jar, and most people stop reading anything past the picture. I learned to judge food before I learned to judge much of anything else, standing at my mother's counter, watching her decide what earned a place in the pantry and what got left on the store shelf. That part of me never left all these years later. So when a jar tells me where it belongs on my table, I don't take its word for it. I turn it over and check. Do you check the ingredient order before you buy something like this? Or do you trust the picture on the front the way most people do without thinking twice? This matters right now more than it did years ago, because a jar like this one sits in more shopping carts than almost anything else in its aisle. And it's usually landing in the cart for the same reason every time. Somebody is trying to get a child fed something they'll actually eat, fast, before school, or before the day gets away from them. That's not a small thing, and I'm not here to make anyone feel foolish for reaching for it. I'm here because a jar that gets reached for that often, for that reason, deserves to be read all the way through at least once, instead of trusted on the strength of a picture alone. This jar is heavier in the hand than you'd expect, and it isn't cheap for what it actually is. You're paying a premium for a name people recognize, not for a jar packed with hazelnuts. And that's worth sitting with for a second before we go any further. The front of the label shows a spoon pulled through the spread, fresh bread in the background, a table set for morning. Warm light, a family kind of scene. The back of the jar, in much smaller print, is where the real truth of what's inside actually lives. And nobody designed that print to be the first thing you read. I turned it over, and there it was. Sugar comes first on this ingredient list, and under the rules every packaged food label has to follow, that means sugar makes up more of this jar than anything else in it. More than the hazelnuts it's named for, more than the cocoa, more than anything. That's not an accusation of anything underhanded. It's simply how the list is required to be ordered. Heaviest ingredient first, no exceptions. The plain conclusion, though, is hard to soften. A spoonful of this jar is closer to a spoonful of sugar than a spoonful of nuts. My verdict on that first line alone, before I even get to the second ingredient. This is a dessert spread wearing a breakfast label, and the ingredient order says so before I ever open my mouth about it. Palm oil comes second. It's what keeps this spread smooth and easy to scoop at room temperature, instead of separating the way real ground hazelnuts and cocoa naturally would on their own. I'm not going to fault a company for using it. Plenty of shelf-stable spreads lean on it the same way. But I want you to sit with this plainly. The second heaviest ingredient in a jar, sold on the strength of its hazelnuts, is an oil, not a nut. Read that again. Second heaviest ingredient in the jar, an oil. Does that surprise you? Or had you already guessed it? The way you can sometimes just feel a texture is being held together by something other than the ingredients on the front of the label. Now here's where I expected to feel worse than I actually did. And I think it's worth admitting that plainly, instead of pretending my reaction never wavered. Hazelnuts land third on this list, and that 13% I asked you to hold on to at the very start is the figure Ferrero itself has put on roughly how much of this jar is genuine hazelnut. You'd assume a chocolate hazelnut spread would be built mostly around the nut sitting right there in its own name. It isn't, not by a wide margin. Sugar and palm oil together outweigh the hazelnut content by a distance that surprised me even after years of doing this. That's the number from the opening of this video, and now you know exactly what it means. And here's the part that runs against what most people assume walking down that aisle. You'd think paying more for the jar automatically buys you more hazelnut, more of the good part, less of the filler. It doesn't. Not necessarily. Price on a shelf tells you what a company believes its name is worth to you. It tells you nothing about where an ingredient sits on its own list. I've picked up a pricier jar before, felt better about the purchase simply because of what I paid, and never once turned it over to check whether that feeling was earned. It usually isn't. Cocoa sits fourth, in a modest enough amount to give the jar its colour and its chocolate flavour, without ever trying to pass itself off as an actual chocolate bar. That's the one ingredient here doing roughly what you'd expect, in roughly the amount you'd expect it to. And I'll credit it for that plainly and move on, because fair is fair, even in a video built around a verdict. There's a small, quiet relief in reaching an ingredient that doesn't need 3 sentences of explaining. It just does its job. Then comes skim milk, followed by reduced minerals whey, both dairy derivatives that add body and a faint milkiness you'd probably never notice on your own tongue, but that matter a great deal if anyone under your roof has a milk allergy and is trusting the front of this jar without ever checking the back. I had a niece with a dairy allergy years ago, and I learned the hard way that the words chocolate spread printed on the front of anything tell you absolutely nothing about what's actually sitting inside it. Check that line yourself before this jar goes anywhere near a child's plate in your house. That's a small thing to most people reading this label, and an enormous thing to a handful of families reading it. And I think that gap is exactly why reading the whole list matters more than reading the part that applies to you personally. A label doesn't know who's holding it. It just lists what's inside, in order, and leaves the sorting out of what matters to the person doing the reading. Soy lecithin shows up next, quietly doing the unglamorous job every emulsifier does, keeping the oil and the solids in this jar from separating into a mess you'd have to stir every single time. On its own, in the amount it's used here, it isn't the story of this video. I only mention it because if soy is a concern at your table, this is the exact line you'd miss if you only ever read the front of the jar. And last on the list, sitting where most people have already stopped reading, vanillin, an artificial flavour. Not vanilla, vanillin, the manufactured version, added in a small amount to round out the flavour of the whole jar. I trusted brands like this one for years, on nothing but the name printed on the front, before I ever turned a single jar around myself and found the word artificial waiting quietly at the very end of the list, right where nobody bothers to look anymore. Here's where my own reading of this label lines up with something a federal court already looked at directly. Back in the years just after this jar became a genuine fixture in American kitchens, two mothers in San Diego took Ferrero, the company behind Nutella, to federal court, arguing that the marketing, the breakfast table imagery, the language about this jar forming part of a balanced morning, oversold what a jar, built the way this one is actually built, could honestly claim to be. Ferrero settled that case, and afterward changed the wording on its own label and its own advertising. I didn't need that lawsuit to tell me any of this. I'd already read the same thing for myself, straight off the ingredient list. Sugar first and hazelnuts third. The court just confirmed years later what the label had been saying quietly the whole time, if anyone had bothered to read it the way I just did with you. I don't say that to suggest anyone sat down and decided to deceive a single mother standing in an aisle. I don't believe that, and I'm not accusing anyone of it here. I think it's simpler and, in some ways, more ordinary than that. A picture gets chosen because it sells. Words get chosen because they sound wholesome. And nobody stops to ask whether the ingredient list underneath still agrees with the picture. That's not a crime. It's just a reason to keep reading past the front of the jar every single time, no matter whose name is printed on it. Would you have caught that ordering on your own, standing in the aisle with a cart already half full and somebody pulling at your sleeve to keep moving? If you're the kind of person who turns the jar around before it ever goes in the cart, that's exactly who I'm making these videos for. Not for anyone chasing the picture on the front of a label, for the ones who want to know what's actually sitting inside before they decide anything. That's the only invitation I'm going to give you today. Now, I want to be fair about something, because a fair look earns more trust from you than a one-sided one ever will. This ingredient list is short, and every single word on it is one you'd recognize without needing a chemistry degree to picture it. Whatever else is true about this jar, Ferrero isn't hiding this spread behind a wall of numbered additives the way some other brands do. That's worth saying plainly, out loud, in a video that's otherwise been fairly hard on it, and it's more than I can honestly say for some of the imitation spreads sitting on the very same shelf. I'll admit something else while I'm being fair. There were years, plenty of them, where a jar of this exact spread sat in my own cabinet without me ever once turning it around to check what was actually first on that list. I bought it because everyone bought it, because my own children asked for it, because the jar itself looked like something a good morning was supposed to include. It took me a long time to separate the feeling a label gives you from the facts actually printed on it. And I still catch myself slipping back into that trust every now and then, out of habit, before I remember to check. Do you think a short, recognizable ingredient list makes up for sugar sitting first on it? Or does the order still matter more to you than the length of the list? A premium price and a familiar name on the front of a jar tell you exactly what a company wants you to feel while you're standing in that aisle deciding. They will never tell you what's actually first on the ingredient list, and they were never designed to. That information only ever lives on the back, in the small print, waiting for somebody to turn the jar over and actually read it before it goes in the cart. That's true of this jar, and it's true of nearly every jar, can, and box sitting near it on that same shelf, whether the name on the front is one you've trusted for 1 year or for 30. I didn't grow up with jars like this one at all, and maybe that's exactly why I never learned to stop reading past the picture on the front. Whatever a label is trying to make you feel, the list on the back doesn't care how it makes you feel. It just sits there, in order, telling the truth to whoever's willing to read it. One word from you in the comments: breakfast or dessert. Tell me which one this jar has actually earned in your house, now that you've read the whole label with me instead of just glancing at the picture. Availability shifts a little by region, and ingredient lists do get revised over time as companies change suppliers or reformulate. The label I read today is the one sitting on the shelf at Publix right now. So check your own jar before you take my word for a single line of this. So, remember that 13% I handed you at the very start of this video, before you knew what it meant? That's the whole answer, sitting right there. A jar built mostly from sugar and palm oil, with the hazelnut it's named for landing at only about 13%. Wearing a breakfast label a federal court already made Ferrero soften once before, years ago, for exactly the reason I just walked you through myself. My honest verdict, the one I promised you at the start. This is not a breakfast food, and I stopped treating it like one a long time ago. As a dessert, bought and eaten plainly as exactly that. It isn't the worst jar on that shelf. The list is at least honest with you once somebody actually reads it start to finish. If you're going to keep a jar of this in your own house, keep it in the cabinet with the treats, not the one you reach for on a rushed weekday morning, and let your children know it the same way. But I haven't bought a jar of Nutella since I left, and I don't plan to.